Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is the 1979 horror classic, When a Stranger Calls. Now, When a Stranger Calls was co-written and directed by Fred Walton, and the movie is actually based on a short film that Fred Walton did 2 years earlier called The Sitter. Now, during some screenings of the movie Looking for Mr. Goodbar, The Sitter was actually shown as sort of a bonus feature right before the actual movie. And producer Doug Chapin was so impressed with the short film that he acquired the rights and commissioned Fred Walton to turn The Sitter into a feature-length movie. Now, both this movie and The Sitter are based on the old urban legend of the babysitter and the man upstairs, which is the same story that inspired the 1974 film Black Christmas, and I think John Carpenter's Halloween also owes a lot to that story as well. Now, that urban legend is said to be loosely based on the real-life unsolved murder of Janet Christman, which if you get a chance to look into that actual case, it's honestly really fucked up and would make a fascinating movie unto itself. And it's so sad and tragic because the poor girl was only 13 years old and she still hasn't gotten justice for what was done to her because, I mean, there was a lot of circumstantial evidence pointing to somebody who both knew her and the family she was babysitting for, and the police investigated into it, but they kind of botched the investigation, and there was a lot of corruption and incompetence in the police department, and there were even links to other sex crimes in the area. Again, it's a fascinating case that I'm not going to go too detailed into because that's not what this video is about, but I do recommend looking into the actual case. Now, I have kind of an interesting history with this movie. I actually first found out about the film when I was 9 years old. I might have even been 10, but I would have just turned 10. I distinctly remember that it was during a blackout and my aunt decided to tell me, my cousin, and my cousin's friend, who weren't much older than I was, some ghost stories. One of those stories being the old urban legend of the babysitter and the man upstairs. And of course it scared the shit out of us, especially because we were sleeping in the basement den during a blackout. And my aunt mentioned how the story was made into this movie called When a Stranger Calls. Later on, we ended up renting the movie from Blockbuster. This was the early 2000s when Blockbusters were still around. I think we even rented it on VHS. And I think I certainly liked it at that age, but honestly, this is a movie that I appreciate so much more as an adult, because I actually think this is a much more mature and psychological horror film than I think people remember. So the plot of When a Stranger Calls is it begins where this teenage girl named Jill Johnson is hired to babysit these two kids while their parents are out to dinner and a movie, and as the night goes on, she starts getting these disturbing phone calls asking her, "Have you checked the children?" And at first she takes these as some sick joke, but as these phone calls get more and more persistent, she becomes convinced that whoever's making these phone calls not only knows where she is, but is also watching her. Now, a lot of people think that that's the whole movie, and literally that's only the first 20 minutes of the film. Now, I am gonna have to give away some spoilers here, but in this section of the film, she calls the police and they say, "Oh, we'll trace the calls," and they end up tracing the calls and find out that they're coming from inside the house, and we find out that this man making these phone calls had already killed the children. The movie then jumps ahead to 7 years later, and we learn that this maniac who was harassing Jill and killed these children, whose name was Kurt Duncan, he escapes from the psychiatric hospital, so the father of the children hires the cop who originally arrested him, who's now working as a private detective, to go after him. And that's most of the movie from then on, and most of the movie from then on is really about this killer, about Kurt Kurt Duncan, and it becomes this hardcore psychological character study where this psychopath is the lead character. And most of the movie is really about Kurt Duncan kind of trying to put his life together and kind of trying to force himself to be sane and normal, but as it goes on, it becomes increasingly apparent that that's not possible, and this detective who's going after him eventually realizes that he might have to kill this guy. And then the final act of the movie is about Kurt Duncan going after Jill again, who at this point is a grown woman and has children of her own. So, the movie is very episodic in how it's structured, where you could break the movie up into 3 segments, and it's almost an anthology film where it's 3 separate stories that just feature the same characters, but each segment sort of has a feel all its own. So, I love When a Stranger Calls, but I love it for a lot of the reasons that people don't like this movie. A lot of people say that the middle portion of the film, where it really focuses on Kurt Duncan, a lot of people say that those scenes drag on, and I really don't think it does, and in my opinion, it's the best part of the movie. I love the fact that this starts off as a slasher film, but becomes more of a psychological drama that you could really compare to movies like Taxi Driver, or even later films like Manhunter, or Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, or even Joker, where we're really getting inside the mind of this killer, and the film is really a character study on this very deranged, very sick individual. Now, in the film, Jill is played by Kane, and a lot of people think that she's the main character, but she really only shows up in the beginning and the end of the film. I mean, she is ostensibly the protagonist of the first 20 minutes, which is what most people remember about the film. Like I said, the movie does sort of work as a pseudo-anthology. Now, you could argue the fact that she only shows up in the beginning and the end of the film is sort of a narrative flaw with the movie, and maybe it would have made a lot more sense to have a scene in the middle of the film where the detective calls her up to warn her that Duncan has escaped, but at the same time, it would have made the scene where she does find out that he escapes, which is the scene at the restaurant where she gets a phone call, and the phone call asks her, "Have you checked the children?" It would have made that scene a lot less impactful. But Kane is very good in the movie, and Jill is a likable character. You could say it's a bit of a flaw, the fact that she never does actually check on the children when she gets these phone calls, but in a way that's also kind of the point, and it also really wouldn't have mattered because Duncan had already killed these children before he even started making these phone calls to Jill. Now, technically, the true protagonist of this film is actually the detective John Clifford, played by Charles Durning. And Charles Durning is very good in this movie, and I like how in the film, he's not always the most likable character. There are points where he is kind of an asshole, and he borderline harasses certain people to get information out of them. And he sort of goes from being an actual cop to more of a vigilante, because at first he sets out to apprehend Duncan, but as the story goes on, he realizes that he actually wants to kill this guy. And you can tell that this case has really haunted him for all these years, and even though these weren't his children who were murdered, he still sort of takes this personally, and ultimately it becomes more about revenge than actual justice. But the standout performance in this movie is definitely Tony Beckley as the antagonist Kurt Duncan, and he gives such an understated yet chilling performance as this character. This was Beckley's final film, and he was apparently terminally ill when they were making this, and died only 6 months after the movie came out. And Beckley plays this character in such a way where you almost find yourself feeling some sympathy for him, while at no point does the movie make excuses for what he did. I mean, this guy killed 2 innocent children in cold blood. It's very hard to empathize with somebody like that, but at the same time, Duncan is portrayed as a man who is severely, severely mentally ill and might not be completely in control of his actions. And there's a really interesting moment in the film where he's standing naked before a mirror and he's remembering his time at the mental hospital, but he's also remembering what he did to these children. And you don't see it, thank God, but you do see these little flashes of the beds soaked in the blood of these children, and you see him get into the bed. Just the implication of that is just so disturbing and so stomach-churning and really does make your skin crawl. But there's this look on his face as if the realization of what he did has finally hit him, and you see him break down crying. It's a very, very psychological performance. Now, when I first saw this movie as a little kid, at that age I was more used to the more fantastical kind of horror films, so I think it really stood out to me the fact that the villain of the film is not some supernatural force like Freddy Krueger. He's not some unstoppable killing machine that may or may not be supernatural like Jason or Michael Myers. He's not even a criminal mastermind like Hannibal Lecter or the Joker. He's just this deranged and in some cases very sad and pathetic man. Colleen Dewhurst is also really good as this woman that Duncan is kind of stalking throughout the film, and when Detective Clifford finds out that she may have had contact with him, he basically kind of uses her as bait. Rachel Roberts, who people might recognize from Picnic at Hanging Rock, has a small role as Duncan's psychiatrist, and Ron O'Neal, who people might recognize from movies like Superfly and Red Dawn, has a small but memorable role as Lieutenant Garber. So yeah, When a Stranger Calls, I think, is a very good and very well-made psychological thriller, and the first 20 minutes is just top-notch suspense, but the rest of the movie is a really powerful and gritty crime drama. And like I said, I think it's a much more adult horror film than it's given credit for, and I think at the time it was kind of dismissed as being a Halloween knockoff, and sure, they're both stories about babysitters being terrorized by maniacs, but if you actually watch both movies, they could not be more different from each other. I just want to mention that this past Labor Day weekend, I actually got to see this movie at a drive-in theater in Pennsylvania, where they were having this big slasher movie weekend. They also showed the first 3 Sleepaway Camp movies, and Friday the 13th Part 4, and The Burning, and Madman, and movies like that. And the film did go on to be fairly influential. You could see the influence of this movie in films like Candyman, Urban Legend, and especially Scream. Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson outright said that the opening of Scream was heavily inspired by the opening of When a Stranger Calls. This movie also had a made-for-TV sequel in 1993 and a remake in 2006. Now, before I end this video, I want to cut to my friend John giving some of his thoughts on this movie.
Hello everyone, this is my honest thoughts and opinions on When a Stranger Calls for Christian's channel. What I like about this movie, that's a simple concept of a girl who is babysitting, and she gets this random phone call from a random stranger she does not know. He calls her playing tricks on her, asking her if she has checked the children. Her mind is spinning, racing, not knowing, is this a prank call or is this guy being for real and serious? The killer tortures Jill psychologically. The police believe it could have been just a prank call or nothing serious, but little did they know. The big twist is when the police call her saying that the call was traced in the house. It was a trick that the whole time the killer was inside the house. You're rooting for Jill to run upstairs and save the kids, but it was too late. The movie is one of the scariest opening scenes ever in horror movies, like something out of an Alfred Hitchcock movie. The first time I heard about this movie was on Bravo's 100 Scariest Movie Moments, where they talk about the opening scene being one of the most iconic movie moments in horror, right up there with Jaws, Halloween, The Ring, Scream, and Night of the Living Dead. I was curious to see this movie after seeing Bravo's 100 Scariest Movie Moments list. It's a good horror movie where it's not about a ghost, a supernatural, satanic cult, witchcraft, vampires, or an evil mad scientist. It's a realistic horror movie that could happen to anyone in real life. It doesn't try too hard. It's very simple, straightforward. This concept goes back to urban legend folklore, babysitting, and The Man Upstairs. This was surprisingly based on a true story. In 1950, a babysitter named Janet Christian was raped and murdered while she was babysitting. She was 13 years old at the time. The kids were unharmed and were asleep while it happened. Despite calling the police, the phone line was disconnected before she gave any information. To this day, the case has never been solved, despite having some suspects. 3 years later, in 1953, 15-year-old Evelyn Harley from Wisconsin was abducted when she was babysitting a baby girl. The child was not harmed. They found traces of blood in the basement outside the house and showed signs of struggle, but to this day, Evelyn has never been found. Charles Durning does a great job in this movie, playing a detective who's been on the case for years, trying to find the killer, but not going by the book, and not bringing the killer to justice. You root for him throughout the entire movie to find the killer and kill him. Charles Durning was another one of those great character actors who was in a lot of good stuff like Dog Day Afternoon, The Sting. He was also known for a lot in comedy movies and TV shows like Tootsie, To Be or Not to Be with Mel Brooks, and Everybody Loves Raymond. The killer, Kurt Duncan, played by Tom Beckley, was a real scumbucket. I have no sympathy for this character. The part when the killer's at the bar hitting on some woman, he can't take no for an answer. Some other random guy beats the crap out of him, but again, the killer was a piece of garbage and he deserved it. Carol Tain does a good job despite only in the first 20 minutes. Then we see her in the last half, where she's been the last couple of years after that horrific event in her life. She's married, has 2 kids, her husband got a promotion at a job, she's a stay-at-home mother. They go out and celebrate after his promotion. She gets a call from the killer. It's deja vu all over again for her, but this time it's her own children. I won't spoil it, just go watch the movie. The phone call is one of the most popular things to be seen in a lot of horror movies. It reminded me of like Mario Bava's Italian anthology horror movie Black Sabbath, where a girl gets a phone call from a random stranger who wants to kill her for no reason. Or even a few years prior to this movie, Black Christmas used the phone call from a random stranger who was inside the house the entire time. For you Scream fans, that Kevin Williamson said that he took inspiration for this movie for the first Scream movie for the opening scene with Drew Barrymore. I did not know there was a sequel to this movie, but I never saw it. In 2006 there was a remake, never saw it, so no comment on this. I also had no idea there was a short movie to this directed by Fred Walton. When he was just starting as a film director, he made this into a short movie 2 years prior, and then eventually, after some recognition, he made this into a feature full-length film. I never saw this either, and actually it was never released until like recent years on Blu-ray. Kind of similar with like Sam Raimi's Evil Dead first movie, Within the Woods. I might want to check this out for curiosity. That wraps up my thoughts on When a Stranger Calls. Thank you, Christian, for having me on board for this. See you next time. Hope you liked my comments.
So yeah, that was my review of When a Stranger Calls, and my next movie review will be on When a Stranger Calls Back.